afraid we're going to have to move on to our next question, simply because of time, and I wouldn't want to keep anyone here for longer than they want to be. Which brings us neatly on to our third question from Darren Rushing. Darren.
Thank you. Is it ever acceptable for employees to be expected to regularly do excessive amounts of unpaid overtime?
Darren, the latest figures I've seen claims more than 50% of teachers do overtime, an average of 12 hours a week, more than most other professions. I'm only going on the average. Carol Leeming, I expect you put the hours in, don't you?
Well, I work in the arts and we're known for exploiting ourselves. However, I have to say, I don't agree. I think if you're doing the work, then you should be paid for it. Everybody else in industry and everywhere else gets paid to do overtime. I don't hold with this kind of Victorian middle class thing about volunteering and isn't it great, because actually it's energy, it's effort, and also it's unreliable. You know, if you're just relying on volunteering all the time, well, you know, it's not a great basis to build things on. And what you're doing is you're actually demoralising your staff. You're demoralising teachers, you're actually sort of bleeding them dry, you're draining them, and we should be valuing them. So I don't agree with it.
Matthew Callahan.
When I was a kid, I thought, God, I'm going to be a teacher. They finish at 4, on holidays. What a life! What a life! And of course, the reality is very, very different. I mean, it's not only the preparation of classes and all the rest of it, but also, well, you know, there's the extracurricular activities and all that teachers give. And that's why we call it a vocation, so that we can squeeze a lot more for no cost. But let's not just think about the teachers. I mean, there's also the support staff. And I have to say, support staff in schools get a real awful deal. You know, the contracts are limited. On Blackwood Road in the Ashby ward, and you know, chap says, you know, really, you know, just listening to what he has to go through in terms of the type of contract that he's got, the hours he's working, and the extra he has to put in. And you think, you poor soul, I wouldn't like your job. And talk about minimum wage, that guy's on far less than the minimum wage for the hours he does. So I think we need to give a fair deal for the support staff, and if it means paying extra, then so be it. But also, as I say, I do think that teachers are stressed, are under pressure, and to that extent, it's going to be reflected in the work that they're going to do. And I think the other thing is that, let's face it, the politicians also, we put the stress on teachers and the rest of it through all the statistics required, the reorganisations and the rest of it. And to that extent, we're as guilty as the rest of it. So I'd say to the politicians, let's back off a bit and give teachers a break.
Of usual questions, I'm sorry to deal with, but I'm keen to know, because there was a groan when I said about doing on average 12 hours overtime a week, a little roll call, if you could just, one after the other, if you could just tell me roughly what extra hours you're doing at the moment. So, yeah?
I work on Mother's Day, I've got 2 children, then Monday night I talk all day, and then parents evening until 9 o'clock. Then I have an inspection. Spent 2 hours preparing lessons. I've probably done well over 12 hours this week.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Teachers and head teachers in Leicestershire are working between 50 and 60-hour weeks, as I understand.
Yeah. 60-hour weeks. Yeah.
2 parents' evenings this week, a lesson observation, and this morning probably put in 70 hours this week.
Anyone else?
I'm working about 70 hours every week. I've done that for a couple of years. I'm currently on the 0.8 timetable and I'm doing 70 hours a week. And I'm sorry, but we're doing this for nothing, and it's killing ourselves and it's destroying the quality of our teaching. Because if you do that, with respect on the world, you can't always have the enthusiasm that you normally put into your job because you're just too tired. So
Nicky, obviously the question was, is it ever acceptable for employees to be expected to regularly do excessive amounts of unpaid overtime? Obviously, as you heard there, some are. Why is that acceptable? Well, okay. All right, okay. We're not at the town hall, it's not Panto.
Do you think, John, you're going to go home with the idea and the clear impression tonight, the bright impression that teachers are working incredibly hard in this country, and I think that adds maybe a little longer than perhaps radio presenters, but although you're working here tonight. Look, the point is we know that our teachers are working longer than their international counterparts. You're not necessarily teaching for longer, the evidence shows, but you're working for longer. And so we have been working in the Department of Education since I took on office, and we launched the Workload Challenge in October, and thank you. And I suspect that people in this room were part of the 44,000 people that responded to that, which is actually what is that work. Now I think it is a whole collection of things. It's obviously things like parents' evenings, but lesson planning, marking, data collection, dealing with changes that come from government, inspections from Ofsted, the accountability framework. Yes, absolutely, and I completely understand that. There have been a lot of changes over the course of the past 5 years, and that's why in the response to the Workload Challenge, we committed as a government not to introduce changes in the middle of the course. Ofsted have said that they only introduce changes to their handbook no more than once a year, and I'm hoping that we might be able to get that down. We can look at other ways of lesson planning and say data collection. What do we ask for? Do we need to ask for it? How is that data used? And marking. And again, when I go visit schools up and down the country, I can see that there are some schools, some heads, chairs of governors and others who really have worked with their staff to understand the workload pressures and help them address. And some were clear that's not the case, and actually staff have been asked to take on a lot. And what's happened is a diktat has come down from on high, as we pass down from head to head of department to member of staff in order to do. And so I think we've got a lot more to do on this. The workload response was a first step. It was a response to conversations I had with people like Christine and others from coming into office, and I would like to do more than that, but we will have to do that with the profession. As I said in my conference speech last year, we don't want teachers who are too tired and too stressed to do the job properly. And we're going to have another big workload survey next year to work out again exactly what it is that people are doing. Before that, there have already been, as I say, 44,000 surveys that resulted in the largest consultation response the DFE had ever seen. And I'm very grateful to everybody who did respond to that. And we want to absolutely keep talking on this, understand exactly what it is, what can we do that would make that difference. But I do agree that a period of stability is absolutely what is needed now in the profession to allow the changes that we have seen to bed in.
Christine, you were in that meeting with Nicky. What's your take on this?
I've been in several meetings with Nicky, and I believe that this leaflet, which some of you may have seen if you're NUT members, which we produced for the Conservative Party conference, which I know Nicky's seen, and she didn't quite reference it directly in her conference speech at the Conservative Party conference, but obliquely. The fact is, workload is at crisis point, and I recognise that Nicky has recognised that. They did launch the Workload Challenge, but the fact is, insufficient has happened as a result of that. And, people will tell you, the wheels of politics grind exceeding slow. But the fact is, there are things which could have been done, which would have made a big difference, which Nicky and her predecessor turned down. So one of them was, all of this curriculum change in secondary schools, we asked for one additional teacher training day so that colleagues could work on the curriculum together. Rejected. One day. Now I know people will say every day that a child loses in school is a problem, but one day for teachers to do that would have not been too much. And plus, of course, we have just got to tackle Ofsted. Now, there is no Ofsted. We have to have a different system. I noticed today on the Times Ed, and I don't always read this, but there's a picture of David Cameron on the front, and it says, "Our whole approach is about trusting teachers." Well, I'm sorry, but go and tell that to people who have just had an Ofsted inspection. That is not how teachers feel. They just don't feel like that.
And the fact is that unless we get a different approach from Ofsted and on the accountability measures, then teachers will go on having to do these ridiculous numbers of hours. And I can tell you, it's heart-rending to read this. And since last September, not enough has changed to make people want to stay in the profession. And the fact is that we're now under-recruiting into teaching, which must be a big concern for you, Nicky. John Howson's numbers on the recruitment of teaching are way down. I mean, it is a real problem. And if you read the front of this, 90% of teachers said they'd considered giving up teaching during the last 2 years because of workload. Now this is admittedly a self-selecting survey, but it's over 16,000 over one weekend. 87% said they knew at least one or more colleagues who had given up in the last 2 years because of workload, and 96% said their workload had a negative consequence for their family or their personal life. And I can remember the first time I met Nicky when she came into office, I said, I have met all manner of young women teachers who say to me, I can't even think about having a family. I can't even have a cat because I just have no time in my life to do anything except my job. Now, of course, teachers have always worked long hours. Of course, they've always worked way beyond the end of the school day. Of course they have. But there are two things about that. One is that a lot of that was choice. When I first started teaching in 1973, the year after you were born, Nicky, I used to do things at weekends. We used to do mode 3, we used to do tons of things. You ask the teacher if they had time to do additional things, of course they don't, because they're actually having to spend so long. And I tell you what else is really very serious about Ofsted, and it's this. In those talks, which the teacher unions have had with Nicky, but also with David Laws and also with civil servants, we managed to get Ofsted to produce a list of myth busters, things that you don't have to do, okay? Some of you might even have seen this in your schools. I can tell you, I have been to schools where the head teachers did not believe that this was true. They thought this was a hoax perpetrated by the NUT because it was saying there are things that you don't have to do. So the fear and the way people feel about Ofsted is so deep-seated that we will never improve teachers' working lives. We will never make it the attractive profession that it ought to be unless we get a radical change to Ofsted. And from the NUT's point of view, that would be abolition of Ofsted and a replacement with a proper, acceptable professional inspectorate system.
You were acknowledging there has been some changes since last September, and we have made some efforts, and that's been very important to me and the team. I'm very aware of the Ofsted Myths and Facts document and the work that went into it, and the fact that there are still, I go to schools where actually there is a question mark about whether in fact, even though it says we don't have to do this, we still think we should. And that is something I'm very determined that we need to end. If we are saying, you are saying, Ofsted is saying, we don't want this to happen, then I do not think it needs to happen, and we need to keep making that clear. That's what we will need to do, working together.
Can I just say, by the way, that when the workload response came out from government, it did say that there would be in future biannual surveys of workload. Now, I'm sure you know this, Nicky, but biannual means twice a year, not every 2 years. And we were prepared to say, no, every year is fine. In fact, it's going to be biennial, so it will only be every second year.
Howard Stevenson, is it ever acceptable for employers to be expected to regularly do excessive amounts of unpaid overtime?
Okay, well, I left school teaching for the cushy life of an academic in Ivory Tower in 2002. I taught at Hindley's Community College, just over the other side of the motorway. And I can remember in my leaving speech, I questioned whether, somebody were there actually, I questioned whether teaching was a sustainable lifetime career. Because at the age of 40, having taught for 15 years, and having worked a lot and seen, in a sense, what I can only describe as casualties in that system, it didn't seem to me to be the sort of career that people could see through well into their 50s and into their 60s, and of course with pension changes, some increasing expectations there. There was a lot of talk about workload at that time. I think the workload agreement came in not too long after, so that people were very sort of vexed by the idea. But it seems to me that 15 years later, the problem's just got bigger and bigger. There's lots of data now. We see it in the workload surveys, the stress surveys. So the big challenge is to make teaching a sustainable lifetime career. And I think there's a retreat from a commitment to that, actually, and an increasing acceptance of an unacceptable sort of bringing burnout replace, bringing burnout replace, bringing burnout. You don't invest a lot in training, you train cheaply, you sweat the labour, and then you move on and you do it over again. And that's not the model that's used or that we see in high-performing systems elsewhere. So we've got to learn from those. And we hear a lot in schools these days about the moral purpose of education and the conviction, quite rightly, that we should have in terms of supporting children and helping them achieve. But there's a moral purpose to supporting staff as well, and that needs to be rediscovered, I think.
You've got a document there that's written in big bold font and red. It always freaks me out. I think the red pen probably going back to my days as a pupil. But tell us what you've got there and your comments on this.
This is something that I've been reading quite a lot recently, and it's titled 8 Steps Nicky Morgan Should Take to Reduce Excessive Teacher Workload. I presume you're familiar with it, so you've at least had the grace to read it. But if not, you can have my copy, like I can say. But one that I wanted to highlight on here, it's to require schools to adopt a binding work-life balance policy. And I think that's absolutely key. There's one thing I had to pick out here being something that I think would make the biggest difference. It would be that, which is, it talks about schools having a proper regard for teachers' legitimate expectations of a healthy balance between work and other commitments. And while I was reading around this whole issue of the teacher's workload and the myriad things that contribute to it, some numbers jumped out at me, which is that from the workload response report, 63% of those who responded said that a fifth of their workload does not benefit children's learning directly. That is true, that is true. For 19 hours of teaching, there would be 22.6 hours of planning, preparation and assessment, basically filling out forms just to prove that you're actually doing your job. You know, when we've heard things bounced around on the House of Buzzing, you have to start trusting teachers, you have to have the faith in teachers, and these things that are happening now are really out of step with that, and it has been going worse. Teachers' workloads, teachers' working hours, since 2010 for the primary teachers are up 9 hours a week in the last 5 years. For secondary teachers it's about 6 hours a week, and that's just in 5 years, those increases. So it's not just that we're talking about should you be expected to do work you're not being paid for, it's should you be expected to do this much work in the first place, and no you shouldn't, because so much of it is not about the job that you decided you wanted to do, that vocation that you decided was about improving education outcomes of children.